we learned that life for Chickasaw women was more joyful, productive, and cooperative than life for pioneer women in Indiana in the 1840s. Today on the Roundtable Perspective, Dr. Wendy St. joins me in examining Southeastern Indian life, life for pioneer women, and the differences between the two opportunities that women in both situations had. Welcome to the Roundtable Perspective. I'm your host, Lee Artz. I'm joined today by my guest, Dr. Wendy St. to discuss the Chickasaw Nation of the Southeast U.S. and pioneer women, and maybe put it in the context of today. Welcome.
Thank you.
Dr. St. got her Ph.D. in Connecticut. Now she teaches American history at Purdue Northwest and written several books, Remaining Chickasaw, 1830 to 1907, Labor and Economy, Indians, and several articles in historical quarterlies, and one that we want to talk about a little bit that you're preparing now on pioneer women. So why don't we do this like a historian would do it? Start far away and move to contemporary times. So, but I'd like to begin with the question historians always get asked. Why would we care about the Chickasaw Indians or the Iroquois Indians or the Pokagon Indians and how they lived in the 18th century? What do we have to learn from that or gain from that?
I'll tell you first of all how I came to do my work on Native Americans. I don't have Native American ancestry, so people were constantly asking me what drew you to this.
Did you do your DNA
history.
like Elizabeth Warren?
I have done my DNA, and I am French Canadian through and through. So I was doing different books that I came across as a graduate student that were revealing of things that I was never taught as an undergraduate or in high school for that matter. And one of the topics was Indian slavery. And I thought, Indians were slaves? And then I learned that they made up 10% of the slave population of South Carolina. And then I looked at other communities where Indians were virtually slaves, because of their economic dependency in the fur trade. And I thought, well, how do we not know this part of our history? And then why is it significant? Well, it's significant for us to know what really happened rather than what we wanted want to happen. I teach Western history now, and it's full of romanticism and all kinds of wishful thinking. But if we're to understand how to live in an international community and how not to make the same mistakes that we made, how to be a more humanitarian society, I think it's important to study what happened and to live with those mistakes and to accept that some of the things we did might not have been.
This may be a slight interruption, but I always have this philosophical question, which if we believe that the past was humanitarian, made up of goodwill and all of these things, and that's the kind of world we want, how does it improve our behavior or our understanding if we learn that we weren't like the pilgrims at Thanksgiving that was sharing everything? How does it...
Well, there are examples of both, and so it's important to understand which were the examples that are worth emulation and which are the examples that it would be better to examine what we did and how we can do better in the future, especially if we see ourselves falling into the same traps because of majority rule or because of economic circumstances making people, quite frankly, more selfish and more hostile to other people. And so if we look at, I'm a specialist in colonial America and in the early republic, you can find examples of really bad behavior. And then other examples where behavior is better. And why was it better? I think when we first sat down before we started taping, we were talking about some aspects of Native American society that were dismissed. They were dismissed because people, quite frankly, just wanted Indian lands. And so it was easy to call them savages.
Even if you were being kind to someone else, you're being kind to them because they're inferior and they kind of need your parentage, and
that's right,
as opposed to being treated as an equal, or even more being an opportunity to learn from a different culture. So.
Right. And then that's the sort of interpretation we've gone with, because people don't want to feel guilty about what we did in the past. But there are contemporaries who lived at the same time as the Native Americans, Anglo-Americans, preachers, ministers, missionaries, who didn't just dismiss Native society as savagery. And those are the documents I'm interested in looking at, because there are some things that they did better. There are some things we can learn.
Let's talk about those. One of the things that is popular today is the polls that show the majority of 20-somethings, college-age students, are more in favor of socialism than capitalism. But then the response by politicians is, well, that would never work. But my understanding, more of the Iroquois than the Chickasaw or the Choctaw, was that they were fairly egalitarian.
That's correct. That's correct. That's correct. The things that they prioritized are maybe different from what we prioritize. So there are a few things I want to talk about of Native American society, and to also say that they haven't been completely forgotten, that there are students and lots of groups that are going to them for inspiration. One of them you mentioned, socialism. I also want to mention
or communalism.
Communalism. Yeah, they wouldn't have called it socialism.
Right, no, right.
A better way of living, like you said, not such sharp contrasts of wealth. And I'll talk about it in a minute when I contrast, say, Kickapoo women to early pioneers of Indiana. I can talk about that. But one thing that I find that my students find really inspirational, that a lot of them didn't know until they took my Native American history class, or in the fall for the first time, I'm going to teach a history of LGBTQ people in America. And I'm starting off with Native Americans, because in several Native American societies, they recognized that there were people who didn't feel quite comfortable just doing male roles or just doing female roles. And so different societies had different terms for these people. The most popular term today is a two-spirit person. But instead of rejecting them, ostracizing them, exiling them, executing them, as people do now around the world, they said that there's a unique spot in our society that these people can occupy, and as a matter of fact, they're valuable to us. And they had, they can do things that nobody else can do in terms of religious ceremonies, in terms of negotiations and treaties, because they can sometimes fit into this persona and that persona. They are the only ones who can bring about these cooperative relations or fulfill these religious responsibilities. And so I think a lot of my students, for instance, who are gay, they look at this model and say, well, why did we throw away that model, and instead having these fixed gender categories and then dismiss everything else as...
Well, that's a long history class, though. You can't answer that question.
No, you can't, but at least I can provide students with a model.
Right. Well, the other one I'd like to talk about, and it may be a segue for when we talk about pioneer women in Illinois and Indiana, is not all Native American tribes have the same social structure, but many, particularly in the East, again, the Chickasaw and the Iroquois and others were matrilineal, and that's a term that we don't hear. We always hear about patriarchal society, and there's the Me Too movement, but there's 800 years or more of history of societies where there was not just feigned or legal equality, but actually decision-making. So maybe you could talk a little bit about...
Sure, I'll talk about it right now. As a matter of fact, I have a Native American student right now, and to some extent, they still carry some of these beliefs. Of course, if you get married today, that's a civil marriage, and their American laws apply. But you know, he always points out, in their society, the women own the property. If they get sick of you, or if you're abusive, or you're not a good provider, they'll just throw your stuff outside the teepee and move on. And he's like, my fiance has warned me that this still applies. But this is where, when I moved from exclusively studying Native Americans to now looking at pioneer women, I see some dramatic contrasts. And if you were going to send me back in time to the early 1800s, or maybe the late 1700s, I would have rather been a Kickapoo woman, and I can tell you why. By the 1800s, when they're under assault, well, you know, then I don't know if I'd want to be a Kickapoo
Yeah,
woman.
right.
But as you mentioned, or you implied, early pioneer women in Illinois, Indiana, Kentucky, they lived under patriarchal rules. And what that meant for the most part is if you're a pioneer man, you know, and when you become older, you can look back and reminisce about the good old days and how much fun it was and how pleasant it was. But if you were a woman, you probably didn't see things that way. For example, differences between Kickapoo women and pioneer women. Kickapoo women, for example, could limit their child size, so they had an average of 4 children. Anglo women at the same time were having 8 or 9, yeah. And so they were constantly having to. Does
this have to do with the larger social structure? Because when I think about pioneer women or pioneer men, I think of somebody in their single wagon with their mule, and they go here, and this is their homestead, and nobody's around. But when I think of Kickapoo or Iroquois or any, there's a community. So
that's correct.
The women weren't isolated.
Yeah, that's another thing I was going to point out. In my study of the pioneer women, so you pointed out the exact problem most of them face. They're isolated in a cabin miles from many other neighbors. And their husbands will leave to go socialize with the men, go hunting on long hunts and leave them behind for a couple weeks, have a good time, or go drinking, have a good time. The woman's always left behind with the children at the cabin. And so they get depressed, they get lonely, they feel incredibly burdened with the household labor. And there's no protection for them. So once they remove from their family networks, they can be abused. It's not against the law to abuse women, and they are.
And you probably wouldn't even. I mean, there probably wasn't even known. I mean,
to be a crime. Yeah. It wasn't known to be a crime, and these women often were abused. And I think the studies show that rural frontier women are abused more often than women in urban areas where people can kind of see what's going on and intervene, like you said. And you know, if your wife is going to go out the next day and people are going to see where the black guy, you might think twice about doing it. And it was far less. It was not at all acceptable in Kickapoo society to abuse your wife. You would be exiled, you would be ostracized, you'd be asked to leave the community, and your wife would throw all your stuff out.
But Kickapoo and other Native Americans were also agricultural societies.
That's right.
How was it possible that they could do agriculture in a collective way as opposed to this homestead where you get 160 acres?
The most successful families, we've looked at a lot of community studies, were families that actually had communal agriculture as a family.
You're talking about a pioneer
I'm
family.
talking about the pioneer families.
Okay.
So the most successful strategy would be to move, you know, it was common to move across the Appalachians and then maybe try your luck in Kentucky and Missouri. When you didn't have a luck there and the Northwest Territory opened and there was virtually free land, you'd head to Illinois and Indiana.
So Indiana was a second choice, is what you're saying?
It was settled later.
I'm just
settled after. But from the perspective of the women, because I have to tell you, in every case I've read, it was the man's decision to move, not the woman's decision. And I can explain why the women were reluctant to remove and why they were finally convinced to make the move.
And why the men wanted to move.
And why the men wanted to move. So the main reason the women were reluctant to move is they didn't want to leave their parents. They didn't want to leave their mothers. They didn't want to leave their sisters. They didn't want to leave their brothers. That is their social network. Yeah. That is the support network. I mean, I have read records of women crying the whole way on the trail. I read one journal of a woman that the family had to turn back. They thought she would die of depression. She was just so distraught. That they had to move back from Illinois to Kentucky. 6 years later, they moved back to Illinois after her mother had passed and her brothers and sisters had moved on. The idea, so why did she finally agree to move again? By that time, she had a large family, lots of children, and she didn't want her children having to move apart and relocate in different states. So she wanted territory in Illinois, enough land and acreage so that she could set up all her children on adjoining property. And then they would communally share the work share the oxen, share the tools, and those would be the most successful community members. So it was actually in the family interest for women to have a lot of children because of the farm labor demands, but only if they had enough money to set them up on lands where they could basically farm communally. It wouldn't be helpful if they had to, you had lots of children, they had to be tenant workers. They wouldn't really provide. Other differences between Kickapoo societies, so I mentioned divorce, abuse. The communal farming could be similar in the best case scenario for women.
The Kickapoo would be the whole community, though. It wouldn't be just based upon your immediate family.
Exactly.
It could be as many, I don't know how big they were, hundreds of people, several families. I'm not sure what the community looked like.
It would be smaller groups because in addition to farming, they would seasonally migrate for fishing and hunting and such, and so they'd be able to move their
What about
wikiyaks.
the political structure, the decision making? Because that was the other thing that always intrigued me about Native Americans, particularly on the eastern parts, that they seem to be more democratic, more participatory, as opposed to the individual family kind of going to the...
That's right. Well, in the Pioneer Society, it was assumed that men were the breadwinners, and so you had to do what they wanted.
Made the decisions.
They made the decision, and that's one of the reasons they wanted to move. So, I mean, there were different things, different depression, there are a lot of reasons why they would find their hard luck. And so they would say, well, I can't make it here, and I'm the breadwinner, and if I can't make it here, we've got to try again. And it really
Well, even for them before they left, one of the reasons they couldn't make it is that even if they're in a smaller community, they were still individually isolated by their own, ability to farm or whatever they owned.
That's right.
As
Very
opposed to the
competitive-minded.
Kickapoo, which would be, would be some sharing so that nobody's going to go hungry in our community.
No, that's exactly right. That was where I was going with the Kickapoos. So they had it built into their larger structure where they would move as a family and go together, and so there would be sharing. Whereas when you had these individual homesteads, you would have a more competitive individual society, a lot of violence, lots of violence. These early communities, my students like reading these terrible stories about the early sports of the day where people would gouge, boxing, bare-fisted, rough and tumble boxing, where they could use any means possible. But for a long time, there was the belief that people moving on the frontier were individualists. And as I mentioned with those community studies, those that were individualists, those were the transients, who never succeeded. They just kept going and going and going. Some of them became bigamists. I was looking at the earliest records of the Ohio Penitentiary. Most of the men were there for bigamy. That's where individualism got you.
Yes, that's right.
But the families that succeeded and flourished and are now known as streets and buildings named after them.
Large
they were large
families
families that settled together and as you said, farmed.
What about I don't remember the tribes that you have studied, nations you have studied, but what's the interaction? Because it would seem like if the pioneers are moving west, they're going to come. It wasn't, contrary to the belief that there's nobody there.
Oh, right.
There's people there. So was there violence that preceded the violence in the family? Was there violence that kind of was the interaction between these collective societies and an order that was trying to promote individual farming?
Yeah, in terms of Indiana, Illinois, History Northwest Territory, George Washington created 3 campaigns against the Indians. He used the
father of the country, George.
The U.S. Army to clear the Ohio River. The Native Americans wanted to keep settlement south of the Ohio River, but the U.S. government wanted that territory to help pay off its debt. They wanted to sell those lands and use that to pay off their debt. So they were really interested in what they called pacifying that area. And so making war on any tribes that continued to resist settlers, to fight, to kill settlers. And so there was a lot of bloodshed. But after, say, these 3 campaigns, the Battle of Fallen Timbers, especially after the British were defeated in the War of 1812, there was little Native American resistance left because they didn't have British allies, they didn't have access to ammunition,
And
they were gradually
by and large, they weren't
the area.
military societies either. Is that true? I mean, the Sioux and the I mean, I understand as you move west, it's
well, they can. If you're talking about the Plains Indians, they were on horseback chasing buffalo, but I wouldn't say that the other Indians weren't military societies, because they had for centuries been fighting other tribes, protecting their territory, and that violence only worsened as they got pushed together, and they had to
less
compete.
land, more people.
Less land,
more
less
conflicted.
game, the need to trap furs to survive, to get those goods that you need to clothe your families, feed your families. So for a while, that violence got more intense. So it was all that more impressive that those Indians were banded together in pan-Indian groups. They had their last hurrah in the War of 1812. Yeah.
And that must have been difficult too, because I don't know if this is true, but the different native nations had different languages. I mean, they certainly had different cultural, so yes. that was a difficulty of banding together with different language.
That's right.
So I'm in communication, so I'm always curious about some of the language, some of the vocabulary that was the different. I mean, the vocabulary you've talked about with the pioneer, the expansion was to pacify.
That's right. That's the language that George Washington used. But in the journals that I've read of women, early settlers on the frontier, by early I mean right after the War of 1812, when there were still stragglers, and there's a lot of pressure for those Indian peoples to move to Kansas or other territory.
Is that when Indiana expands in population? Is that the era as well?
Yes, yes. People don't want to go there in large numbers unless they feel it's safe for their families, unless they're desperate. I mean, only a desperate person would bring their families into harm's way. But those people that have contact with the Native Americans, the main primary source I've been using right now are these Methodist circuit riders. They went from homestead to preach to people and get them to come to their camp meetings, and then try to form churches in the forest. In their records and their letters from their wives, and their wives occasionally wrote journals. I've been amazed at how many friendly relations transpired, and these are the things I want to write about, because it's not very well known.
The friendly relations between
the Native Americans and the pioneer families. I mean, you can't imagine how many times these people were rescued by Native Americans, and you look back and say, what were they thinking?
Yeah. They didn't see the future.
I just read this shocking account the other day in a woman's journal, where she and her brother-in-law and their combined 10 children were traveling to a new location. And they were so desperate and so hungry that her brother-in-law wanted to stage a lottery for which child they'd kill and eat.
Oh, no.
I'm dead serious. And
this is written down in the journal?
Yeah, this is one of the journals I was reading. So lots of times they're explaining what they think were miracles from God. They never credit the Indians for coming to their aid as proof of the Indians'
goodwill,
kindness, goodwill, different society. They always say, oh, God intervened. And God intervened because they encountered a group of Native Americans who had just caught a buffalo, and seeing how hungry and tired they were, they gave them a huge flank of the buffalo. And she's like, oh, so we didn't have to kill any of the kids.
Susie is grateful. Yes, we should rename her.
Right. Mm. So all the time when I read these circuit riders, the circuit riders who go from house to house, they're so poor they can't even pay for hotels. And so they sort of rely on the kindness of strangers. Hopefully these will be converts, but they go from place to place. And they often contrast the Native American families so these are more assimilated Native Americans if they have log cabins and accommodations for settlers, but they contrast them more favorably than some of the squatters and settlers, and say that they're more open, they're more hospitable, their houses are cleaner. Yeah. So the contrast isn't negative. And so I think it's good to be reminded of that, and to kind of share share these experiences with people because, again, I think we've rewritten the national history so that we don't feel guilty, and so it's easier to just say, well, they're all savages. So, for instance, every year I have my survey students answer. They mostly have essay questions, but I throw in a couple multiple choice just to see who really wasn't in class or really wasn't paying attention. And I always ask this one question: why were the Cherokee Indians removed from Georgia? And you know, the possible answers could be they found gold in their territory, or they wanted their lands for cotton plantations. And I always have one response being because they were so savage.
Oh, yeah.
And there's always like 10% of students that write because they were so savage. So if you haven't come to class, that is the view that you carry with you. Unfortunately, because it's
well, it would be great if the whole public could have your classes, because I think the things that we could learn about pioneer women and Chickasaw women and others would be helpful for understanding gender and race relations today. Thank you. That's all the time we have on our program. Thank you, Dr. St. Jean, for joining me today on the Roundtable Perspective. I'm Lee Artz. I'll see you next time.